behalf of the Provost and the faculty in the Natural and Behavioral Sciences, I want to welcome you to this spring's Pascal lecture. For more than a decade, Westmont's Pascal lecture series has sponsored lectures and conversations on science and faith and brought in some wonderful speakers. We are doing that again today. This Pascal lecture series is a joint initiative of the 6 departments in the Division of Natural and Behavioral Sciences and the Provost's office. So we're happy to have all of you here, and we are very happy to have as our speaker today Dr. Elaine Ecklund, who is the Herbert S. Autry Professor of Sociology at Rice University. She's been on the faculty there since 2008. She earned a PhD in sociology from Cornell University in 2004. In addition to holding her faculty position at Rice, Dr. Ecklund is also the director of the Religion and Public Life program and a Rice Scholar at the Baker Institute for Public Policy. Dr. Ecklund has authored 2 books and more than 30 research articles. She has op-ed pieces in a range of publications, including the Huffington Post, the Chronicle of Higher Education, USA Today, and the Washington Post, among other places. Maybe the Horizon could get her to make a comment. She's received numerous grants, including some from the National Science Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, and the John Templeton Foundation. Her latest book, which forms the background of what she'll be speaking about today, is called Science versus Religion, What Scientists Really Think, and it was chosen by Times Higher Education as an International Book of the Week and named a Book of the Year on Religion by the Huffington Post. Dr. Ecklund's ongoing research explores how scientists in several national and regional contexts, several is kind of an understatement, right? Something like 12. How scientists in 12 different countries understand religion, ethics, and gender. She's also writing a book that examines how women and men at elite research universities negotiate careers as academic scientists alongside their family life. And Dr. Ecklund has some personal experience with that negotiation, of course, as an academic herself, but this will interest some of the scientists in the room. Her husband, Carl Ecklund, is also an academic. He's a particle physicist at Rice who spends part of his year working at CERN. They have a 5-year-old daughter, Annika, who apparently at a very young age understood some of the complexities of the physical properties behind sippy cups. So maybe she can explain that to us later. But the title of Dr. Ecklund's talk today, as you know, is What Scientists Think About Faith, What People of Faith Think About Science, and Why We Should Care. So we are very happy to have you, Elaine, and look forward to hearing from you. So please welcome her.
Thank you so much for having me. It is just wonderful to be here. It's just a beautiful, beautiful setting. Keep appreciating it. It's just been a pleasure to be here. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm glad that you had the intro that my husband is a particle physicist. There are lots of differences between the kind of work that he does as a physicist and the work that I do as a sociologist. But one big one is that his research subjects, particles, do not speak to him, right? They do not speak to him. And if they did, we would, he thought they did, we would think he was kind of odd. My research subjects speak to me. And I can remember the very first moment that I thought, wow, I think I had to try to figure out what scientists think about faith. And then later on, what people of faith think about science. It was when I was at Cornell University as a graduate student, and I was working on a study of changes in family forms and how churches respond to changes in family forms. And I was attending a small group Bible study as part of my research. And I got chatting with a woman in the Bible study. We were near Cornell University, as I said. And she asked me what I did. And I said, well, I'm a graduate student at Cornell University. And she said, yuck. And I thought, whoa, that is really an unusual response. I mean, Cornell, it's maybe not as good as Harvard, but it's, probably a university many people would be happy their children got into. And she said, I hope that my children do not go there. And I felt like, well, why? So I asked her, why do you not want your children to go to Cornell University? And she says, well, I'm really afraid if they take science classes that the scientists there will turn them away from their faith. I thought, a lot of morals to that story. One is, of course, be careful what you tell a sociologist, right? Because you're going to end up perhaps the topic of a story later on for many, many years. That happened about 10 years ago. But the other is, is this really true, right? That's her personal experience, her perception. But is this really true? And I think that's something that really sparked in me a desire to try to collect empirical data on what a broad variety of scientists think about the topics of science and faith and how they connect together or don't in their personal lives. And that has led me on quite a journey. Broadly speaking, the American public has what I would call a love-hate relationship with science. On one hand, we have someone like an Albert Einstein. He's this kind of avuncular figure that we sort of, even though we may not understand the kinds of scientific theories that he is famous for, we just kind of love him, right? I used to have a picture of him on my wall when I was an undergraduate at Cornell. I was not a science major, but I just thought maybe it would make me appear smart or something. We also have, on the other hand, what I would call the kind of image of the maniacal scientist, right? The sort of stuff of science fiction, someone a scientist who's in a movie, who's going to blow up the world or create some kind of potion that will kill us all, right? It was sort of a threat to society. And somehow Americans are able to really hold both of those images of the scientist in their minds at the same time. We have also a real appreciation for science. And I think it's very important to remember that, according to the most recent National Science Foundation surveys of the American public and their attitudes towards science, 90% of Americans express interest in new scientific discoveries. So Americans are interested in science. They are, for the most part, want their children to benefit from immunizations. Who doesn't want cures for cancer, right? And what about the phrase studies show, right? You hear these commercials for toothpaste. I love these. 8 out of 10 dentists say that Crest, I hope there are no representatives of Crest in the audience, but an 8 out of 10 dentists say that Crest is really the toothpaste for you. And people run out and buy that particular brand of toothpaste because advertisers know that presenting something in a kind of scientific framing, really is sellable to the American public. So we have a kind of trust in science. We also have a kind of suspicion of scientists, and particularly when we look inside religious communities, we have an understanding, a sort of common understanding, that perhaps all scientists espouse the ideas of someone like Richard Dawkins. Here's a recent quote from him. "Religious beliefs are irrational. Religious beliefs are dumb and dumber, super dumb," as if to really drive home that point. "Religion drives otherwise sensible people into celibate monasteries or crashing into New York skyscrapers." And for their part, scientists themselves sometimes blame the perceived public's low understanding of science on religion. They think that perhaps because the American public is so darn religious, that's probably why they don't score well on certain science tests. Scholars have looked at the relationship between science and religion in three kinds of dominant ways. One of these is what I would call, and many have called, the conflict narrative. So someone like Dawkins really espouses the conflict narrative that really religion and science are totally irreconcilable entities and that science wins. Sam Harris puts in that same kind of camp. Someone like Pat Robertson really also is espousing a kind of conflict narrative that religion and science are two kind of dominant entities that are in conflict with one another, and that religion ought to win. There's those like the paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, who have argued that really there should be a kind of non-overlapping magisterium between science and religion, that science should be on one part of things and religion should be on another part, that science should deal with the natural world, that religion should deal with issues of meaning and purpose, and that they really should not overlap. The problem is we have lots of societal examples where they actually do in real people's lives, and what do we do with that? I think the better answer, and one I'm going to argue for here, and I think that social science gives us, is what I would call appreciation of the complexity of the relationship between the two. There are certain conditions in real people's lives where religion and science really do seem to overlap, other conditions where they don't seem to overlap at all. And I think the most truthful understanding is trying to have a deep representation of the conditions under which they do overlap, the conditions under which they inform one another, and the conditions under which they don't overlap. Let's try to dig into what's really going on in our modern world and find out what's happening in the scientific community, with religion's presence or absence there, and also in communities of faith with science's presence or absence there. So that's what I think social science brings to the study of science and religion. A comprehensive, if it's done well, a comprehensive understanding of what real people are doing in their lives, modern day people. It's certainly informed by history, it's informed by theology, but it's not those things. We're interested in what contemporary people think about the religion and science relationship. I want to explain to you just in brief and say that there's much more where this comes from, and if you can feel free to look on my website, which I'll leave with you. I want to tell you in brief about 3 separate studies that I've been working on for the past 10 years. One, which is a study of how religion is understood among U.S. elite scientists. The other, which is a study, an international study of scientists in 8 different national contexts, as well as a study that I just finished of the public, of the American public, and their attitudes towards science. And then I want us to think together for a little bit about what impact, what ways might the results of these kinds of studies have on the way we think about the science and religion relationship in our actual congregations, in the way that as thinking Christians, we really wrestle with these issues together. I think there's some ways in which social science, it can't really tell us exactly how to live our lives, but having a more truthful appreciation of what's going on in the world around us can inform us in a way to live that's more in parallel with our core values. And I think social science can begin to do that. So among U.S. scientists, I spent 2005 to 2008 studying scientists at elite universities. I surveyed 2,200 of them and ended up doing 275 in-depth interviews with them, where I traveled around to universities in the U.S. and held microphones in front of people in their laboratories, and people, that was a very British pronunciation of that word, sorry, in their laboratories. I did too many talks in the UK, so no offense to someone who's in the audience who's actually British. So I carried around my little microphone. Sometimes people wanted to talk very little about this issue. I had interviews that were 15 minutes long, and I had interviews that were 3 hours long. I had a scientist who actually followed me, not in a creepy way, but followed me to my car and just wanted to keep talking to me about these issues. He talked to me for 3 hours about what he thinks about the relationship between science and faith. It's as if he had been waiting his entire life to talk to someone about these issues. And so that, there's a real range, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. Then right now, I'm fully in the midst of doing a study, an 8-country study of scientists' attitudes towards religion. I wanted to see if scientists in the U.S., how they compare to scientists outside the U.S. And these are the countries that we're studying. The U.S., UK, Turkey, Hong Kong, France, Italy, India, Taiwan. I don't have time to delve deeply into why we chose those particular countries, but that's something you want to pick up on, and we can certainly talk about that in the question and answer period. These countries have different levels of scientific infrastructure. They have different religions or lack of religion in their populace, and it's been just a fascinating journey to embark on that study. Today I'll present just a little bit of data from that study from the UK and India. So we had a 50% response rate to our UK survey, which is very high. We have just some representation of things there for you. 56% male, 44% female. We studied in particular biologists and physicists, so we tried to break up the population perfectly there. And we studied both the youngest scientists, what we call rank 1 scientists, graduate students, as well as people who have PhDs, as well as those who are the most advanced in their career, what we call rank 3 scientists in the UK. And we've also then traveled to these particular nations and sat, like I did in the US, with scientists in their offices and labs and asked them face-to-face what they think about these issues. And that's just been a difficult but wonderful journey to carry out that study. I have lots of war stories from doing international research. It's really fun. In India, we got a 40% response rate to our survey. Also hard to get scientists in India to participate in the survey. But we did as best we could there. Reflective of the population there, 66% male, 34% female, 56% biologists, 44% physicists, and we've done 73 interviews with Indian scientists. We're still in the midst there. We're going to try to do about 100 interviews per nation with scientists, which is a lot for any of you who've done interview-based research. Next, I'll move you to the U.S., back to the U.S. We're going to kind of go around the world today a little bit and talk about the U.S. population. And here, for the past couple of years, I've been conducting survey research. I did a 10,000-person survey of the U.S. population, and including what I would call, general population scientists. I wanted to move from elite research universities to trying to understand also people who are scientists working in research and development, scientists who work at all different kinds of universities, and just see how they compare to the U.S. population and their attitudes towards religion. These are the people who will be most likely to be in congregations and for people of faith to be interacting with, so I wanted to get a real pulse on what they think. This project is in cooperation with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, who hopes to utilize the data to do training programs for scientists, as well as training programs and conferences and seminars for people in churches, but particularly evangelicals, to try to have really robust discussions about the faith and science interface. So I'm very much looking forward to your feedback on that piece of the research. We have also done 315 interviews with people in the general population from a variety of different traditions, and I'll share some of that information with you. So first, what U.S. scientists think about faith. I think really the answer to that question depends on whether you see the cup half empty or half full, right? So about 30% of scientists in the U.S. are what I would call secularists and what they would call secularists. These are people who identify as atheists. They have no religious tradition. When we ask them a survey question like, have you been inside a religious organization, even for a wedding or a funeral, some kind of life passage, right? They say, no, not even then. They have a commitment to not being part of organized religion in American society. Surprising to some, about 50% of American scientists identify as having some kind of religious identity and some attendance, participation in a religious organization. Now, you'll find that those religious identities are considerably more diverse and different from the American public, but that's an interesting fact for some. About 20% identify as spiritual. These are people who are not religious but find some kind of abstract meaning or purpose in something outside themselves. And sometimes there's tension between the spiritual scientists and scientists who they think are kind of completely sold out to modernist thinking and are atheists. And I think that's a very interesting intersection to talk about that. First, let me talk to you about the scientists who think of themselves as secular. What's perhaps most intriguing about this group is the reasons that they give for getting where they are. I think there's the popular conception that scientists receive training and then they're kind of turned against religion, that it's their science which makes them secular. Yet, that's really true only in a small proportion of the cases. Here's a typical narrative. As a child, a physicist, as a child, I was infected by religion, but now I am immune. I love this metaphor of the virus. This view is shared by other scientists who are all just astonished at this sort of viral nature of faith-based thinking, which only exists because parents infect their children, and then there's a new generation, and then they go on to infect more. So those scientists were present in this population, but this was not typical. More often were the scientists who gave narratives when we interviewed them that religion has really let them down. And this was a very typical narrative from a woman who's a biologist who I interviewed, this interview had a real impact on me, who said that when I asked hard questions, I was told just to make a decision to believe. My experiences with religion was that it was a way that judgment was passed on people who are different. And she talked to great lengths about her own experiences being raised in a Christian church, in a youth group. She thought of herself as particularly inquisitive, and this was in reference to her youth pastor who told her when she asked hard questions of the faith just to believe, to just don't ask those questions. There's also a group for whom religion is simply foreign. These are people who have little exposure to religion. About 13% of the U.S. elite, of scientists at elite research universities were raised without religion. Looking at it another way, scientists are 3 times more likely than when compared to the general population to be raised in homes where religion was not important at all. These scientists are a fascinating bunch because they aren't especially negative to religion. They just haven't really had much exposure. And I think that's very different than the scientists who are very committed atheists, the scientists who are speaking out most loudly. These are scientists who, while not religious, are not especially negative towards religion, and I think that's an important distinction. Let's turn now to the religious scientists, the 50%. A small proportion of them are evangelical Protestants when compared to the U.S. population. And these are those who are most comfortable with that label evangelicals. These are self-identification labels. So about 2% of the scientists identify with that label compared to about 28% of the U.S. population. When I analyze that a little bit differently and do not ask them whether they identify as evangelical, but say, do they adhere to what we think of as classic evangelical beliefs, so belief in the resurrection, the authority of the Bible, that number raises to a statistically significant amount in magnitude, about 5%. So for those who want there to be more evangelicals in science, that's nothing to write home about. But it is intriguing to me that when we use the label, they're particularly uncomfortable with it, that number increases a little bit when we look at belief systems, identification with evangelical churches, things like that. Mainline Protestants, not too much different between the general population and scientist elite universities. Powerful to me that there are no scientists in this survey population that identified as Black Protestant, which is a major religious identity category in the general population. This, of course, points to the very, very low proportion of African Americans in these scientific disciplines at elite research universities, which is a problem in and of itself. Catholic scientists, about 9%. That has risen historically, so there have been, over the past 50 years, an increase in the proportion of scientists who identify as Catholic, compared to about 30% of the U.S. population, and an overrepresentation of people who identify as Jewish. And these are not just those who identify as ethnically Jewish, but the ones I include here identify as being religiously Jewish to some extent, 16% compared to 2% of the U.S. population. I wanted to know how these scientists who consider themselves religious, especially those who consider themselves evangelical or Catholic, how they live that out in their particular faith communities. I wanted to know if they see themselves as different from those in their faith communities, if they feel freedom to talk about science. I found that they were more questioning, perhaps unsurprising to the scientists in the room, more questioning, always asking hard questions, more questioning than those with whom they sit in the pews. That was their perception. Here's a quote from a chemist who's a Catholic who said, "I think some of my fellow Roman Catholics might accept many things at face value, like finding religious imagery and natural phenomena. Being a scientist makes me want to raise objections like, well, does this grilled cheese sandwich really look like Jesus?" And I Googled Jesus and grilled cheese sandwich, and you could come up with a lot on the internet if you have some time on your hands, as you know. This is really more looks like a Mary to me, but that's what I found. So the response to that, to feeling like they're more questioning than those in their faith communities, is they tend to suppress their science identity when they're in church communities. So they just don't talk about being scientists very much. They're kind of concerned about it raising conflict within their faith communities. They just don't talk about it. They simply say that they do not bring up scientists in their faith communities. They end up practicing what I would call a secret science. One of the respondents brought that up to me. They may have talked about being a scientist, some of the questions they have about particular faith doctrines. They had a difficult experience, is the typical story, and then they decided not to discuss science. The consequence is that there may be the perception within these faith communities that there are not scientists who have faith, which may be particularly damaging to the faith community, particularly youth who might be looking around for a role model of what it would mean to be a scientist who has an active faith. So I want you to try on that idea that there could be a negative consequence for church communities of scientists practicing a secret science. They also want to tell me that they are evolutionists. About 94% of them said that they firmly think that evolution is completely accurate. As 5% of them did not answer that question, which is a pretty low non-answer rate. They have what they would think of as a kind of closeted faith also in their scientific community. They don't talk much about it there. 49% of them do not think their colleagues are positive about religion. 30% did not want to answer that question, which is a high response, non-response. So it's very unusual to have that high a proportion who don't even want to answer a survey question. When I interviewed them and I actually asked them, why do you think that so many people didn't want to answer that question? They were very concerned about how the information would be used. They were concerned about other scientists knowing that they are committed people of faith. And so there's some kind of, whether or not it's true, there's some kind of perception that the academy is not that friendly to people who have committed faith. And again, mine is not the kind of research that could tell you really about whether or not discrimination is happening or environments are hostile, but it should be intriguing to us that it's their perception that it is, which means that they don't talk very much about their faith in the scientific environment. A woman who's a physicist, who I've actually interviewed a couple different times for different research studies, said that I think universities are not always very accepting environments. It is really hard to be a religious academic. She's an Episcopalian personally, because the public opinion is such that you're either religious or you're a scientist. To say you are religious might mean other scientists would question your work. And I asked her, so what happened when you said you were a scientist who's personally religious? Did they actually question your work? And she said, well, I never did actually say that I'm religious, so I don't know if that would really happen, but it's just my perception that would happen. So even the perception, the threat is so strong that she's not going to talk about her faith really under any conditions at work. There is an exception to those who talk about their faith quite robustly in the work environment and talk about their science in the faith environment. And there are those who one scientist told me should be called boundary pioneers, those who seem to cross over the boundaries, the perceived boundaries between science and faith. These are scientists who are personally very religious. They're often those who are the most prestigious. They feel very little risk because of their status. And they are also very, very open about their faith. One of those who was mentioned very often was Francis Collins, who you know of, I'm sure, so a director of the National Institutes of Health. There are some people, this was a sociologist I interviewed, there are some people with very deep beliefs who simply don't let those things conflict. One of the lovely examples is Francis Collins. He's a very serious born-again Christian and obviously a firm believer and manages to live very well with that. Collins was actually the religious scientist who was mentioned most often in the interviews that we did with scientists in the US, and mentioned the most positively, even while in other circumstances scientists tend to deride the things that he believes. So a kind of interesting connection there and tension. Here's a group of scientists that I learned a lot from personally. there are 20% of scientists who see themselves as spiritual but not religious. These are scientists who hold science and faith together in their minds. They think it's incredibly important to have a spirituality which is very consistent with their faith. Very different than the kind of spirituality that sociologists are finding is present in the general public at large, where consistency is not a really high principle, where people in the general public feel like they can kind of pick and choose from different faith traditions to put together something that really works for them. These scientists really wanted something that's very, very consistent with the science that they do. That was a high value. They thought about the possibility of being a spiritual atheist, and this is a term that I've written about quite a lot, and I think something we ought to really try on and think about how the kind of openness of this particular kind of scientist. They also wanted their spirituality to foster an engagement in their students' lives, in civic life, and volunteer efforts. They thought of themselves as incredibly engaged. I found this group of spiritual atheists to be the most interesting, really, of the scientific community that I have interviewed so far. And I would have said most surprising to me. I would have told you before I started this study that there are many, many different ways to be a person of faith, but really only one way to be an atheist. You just don't believe in God. But I totally had my own stereotypes really blown out of the water through doing this study, that there's a kind of complexity here in this community that was totally unanticipated by me. Here's a biologist who's an atheist who says, people who have spirituality believe in God and they think of it that way. Personally, I believe in nature, and I get my spirituality from being in nature, but I don't really believe there's a God. And he went on to talk very persuasively about how he thinks his spirituality really leads him into a deeper relationship with students, and he cares more about them than his colleagues who don't have a sense of spirituality. Let's move just for a moment outside the U.S. to talk about scientists in the UK and India, and I hope this will give you a bit of a taste of things to come in our research as we continue to work on scientists' attitudes towards faith from around the globe. I found some interesting things, I think, through working with this team. So one question that we ask scientists in both the UK and India is, do you belong to a religion? You'll see here that the religious identities of scientists in these two nations are very, very different. So in the UK, 65% of scientists say they have no religious tradition. The largest religious proportion is Protestant, and that's still, of course, because of the presence of the Anglican Church. Indian scientists, on the other hand, 79% of them see themselves as Hindus, while 6% see themselves as having no religion. And we're going to continue to release findings, but we've already had some really nice response from the media for these particular findings. We went then to try to figure out, as we are in all of the countries that we're studying, how do the scientists compare to people in their general population? Are scientists more like one another globally, or are they more like people in their general population, religiously speaking? So we compared UK scientists to the UK population across a couple of different measures. And we see here that UK scientists tend to be a bit more secular than those in the general population in the UK. So 65% say they do not belong to a religion compared to 50% in the general population. Here, when we turn to attendance at services, another marker of religiosity that sociologists are interested in, 68% of UK scientists say they never attend religious services. 47% of the general public in the UK say they never attend religious services. Moving on to beliefs, we ask a question about whether or not you find any truth in religion, to try to capture any way that a person intersects with religion at all. UK scientists, 39% say they find very little truth in any religion, and 16% only in the general population. So again, a bit more secular. And when we move to the God measure, 65% of UK scientists do not believe in God, compared to only 18% of the UK public. So even in a secular society, we see that scientists are more secular. And so the kind of way that we're trying on for explaining this is, are scientists sort of special carriers maybe of secularization? How do we think about that? Do they tend to push secularization in their society? So that's how the UK is leaving us. But let's move to India for a different perspective. So again, how many of you have been to India? All right, fascinating. Okay. So here's the don't belong to a religion. 19% of Indian scientists say they don't belong to a religion, compared to 4% of the general population. But look at the proportion who identify as Hindu. 79% of Indian scientists compared to 76% of the general population. We're trying to unpack to what extent that that's a kind of cultural identity rather than a religious identity. But as we're following up with the interviews, it's seeming to us that it's actually quite meaningful, that it's a meaningful Hindu identity when we actually ask people about the importance of Hinduism in their lives. We get also strikingly different, we asked, of course, this question differently in India, where Hinduism is dominant, sort of don't believe in God or any gods. 11% compared to in the scientific population compared to 2% in the general population. Services and rituals was another thing that we asked about in India. 19% of Indian scientists say that they never attend services or practice rituals at home compared to 4%. And in the general population, 32% attend regularly compared to 59% in the general population. When we go also to getting them to describe the relationship between religion and science, there's some other intriguing findings. We have three major categories. We have the category of independence. So to what extent do I see religion and science as just being independent or separate from one another? We find that in the UK scientists, about 45% see these entities as completely separate, that kind of non-overlapping magisterium perspective, and 44% in India. Conflict on the side of science, UK scientists 38%, in India 18%, so considerably less likely in India to see a conflict on the side of science. And the collaboration perspective, that science and religion can very much collaborate under certain circumstances, about 30% of Indian scientists compared to only 10% of UK scientists. And this is really borne out in our trips to India when we interviewed scientists there, that they talked in much more robust ways about the possibility of science and various kinds of religion really inspiring one another in ways that I've never heard UK or US scientists talk. So a very different kind of perspective in India. So UK scientists, to repeat, seem to really preference science in their worldview, whereas Indian scientists seem to be seeing some room for collaboration. We also wanted to then go into workplaces in these two different nations and try to see if religion ever comes up in the workplace for scientists. We asked a survey question, which is, my religious colleagues, we asked them to respond to this statement, my religious colleagues' research is influenced by their religious views. In the UK, about 11%, in India, about 11%. So the majority claim that religion is unrelated, really, to scientific practice. Nevertheless, when we go into their research institutes and labs and interview them face-to-face, we find that the majority of those we interviewed could give examples when religion has come up. So that's saying to us that in the kind of abstract ideal, they don't think that religion should be entering the scientific workplace, but in their day-to-day lives, how they live their lives, religion does seem to be entering the workplace. Let me give you a couple of different examples. In the UK, there is a different kind of religious climate and a different perception among the science community of what kind of religion is a threat to science. I remember one very powerful conversation with a scientist that I had a couple of years back in the UK, where he said, oh my gosh, you're having such a problem with evangelicals in the US. He said, I'm just so happy we don't have very many evangelicals in the UK. He said, they're a problem for science. He said, your evangelicals in the US are like our Muslims here. Both groups are a problem for science. And so there is just this different perception of the religion that's a problem for science. Of course, you know, I thought that's not very PC of you to really stereotype an entire people group as being a problem for science, but of course I didn't say that to him when I was interviewing them. But you see here just a completely different religious dynamic, which I think is very instructive as we think about these issues. Here's a quote from a biologist who, to give you some texture to that statement, said, I had a Saudi Arabian student once. He was very, very devout Muslim. I couldn't get him to repeat experiments. If the experiment didn't work the first time, then Allah was directing him in a different direction. We didn't ever repeat something that didn't work because that was not exactly blasphemy, but it was being arrogant. It was going against the will of God. And he said, I just don't know what to do with these students, you know, and even though the actual proportion of students who are Muslim, who are going into science, is not that large, it is still present and it looms large in the imagination of UK scientists. This sort of supposedly secular society, all of a sudden we have people in our society and in our very scientific community who seem to take faith seriously. We don't really have the tools to deal with this, and it's something they're really wrestling with. They did talk, especially in India, now traveling over to India, about spirituality, and also in the UK to some extent. So I like this quote from a biologist in India who said there's some greater force there which controls everything. That's what I believe. So in a sense, yes, when I'm doing physics, I'm trying to understand that force. That's probably how religion comes in. So this biologist saw his actual doing of science very much related to his own spirituality, a different kind of thing than keeping them completely separate. Also, a biologist in the UK says a similar thing, that she started to give more thought to its spirituality. So looking for ways of shaping my research out towards topics that are closer to the spiritual questioning that I ask myself. Another big way religion enters into the scientific community in both the UK and India is through the lens of ethics. And here is what I call a kind of moral permeation, that even for scientists who see themselves as completely secular, when it comes to the difficult issues of the scientific life, you know, how am I going to handle the dissemination of this? Should I even do this experiment if something that I discover could be utilized in a way that could harm the environment or lead to proliferation of weapons? You know, these kind of heavy moral issues, or even how should I treat a student, or how much time should I spend a student? They sometimes pick up pieces from past religious traditions to try to deal with those things. And that's what I call a kind of moral permeation. For UK scientists, this happened most robustly when it came to research ethics. Religion permeated scientific research for them by really shaping definitions of what is morally acceptable conduct in research. They thought about religion, even though they were non-religious often, when it came to the ethics for collaboration, how to give credit to whom, the treatment of data, the reporting of results. A biology professor says religion provides a check on those occasions where you might be tempted to shortcut because you want to get something published and you think, oh, that experiment wasn't really good enough, but if I portray it this way, that it will do. And so she said that religion really, her faith really holds her back then and keeps her going down the path of really double checking things to make sure that she gets it right. Very different context in India, who they talked about their faith traditions as providing a kind of orienting ethos, a kind of morality that shapes all of what they do in science and how they utilize science to actually care for society. And I wish I had time to show you this very powerful video that the Indian postdoctoral fellow I worked with, Brandon Vayadinathan, took when he was in India doing interviews for this project. And he just took a picture of the kind of poverty that was present on the road to the research institute where he was studying scientists. And the kind of difference, the kind of huge disparities that these scientists see every single day when they step outside of their offices. And they have to find a way to deal with that. How are they engaging in lives of research when people around them are at risk of disease or at risk of even malnutrition for not having enough food. So how do they spend $30,000, what would be equivalent of 30,000 US dollars on a microscope when people right outside their door are malnourished? And so that really weighed heavily on them. And they talked a lot about the relationship of faith as providing a kind of orienting ethos for how they do their work. One scientist said that the fundamental spirit that should govern science, a good scientist is one that does work that alleviates poverty and human suffering. Spirituality makes a man soft and kind towards humanity, helps me to understand the problem of the poor people. And this assistant professor of biology gave a particularly poignant quote that if you walk out of campus, you will see a bunch of kids with no clothes on their backs. So you think immediately, I just spent $1 million. I better get something out of it, which hopefully is useful for somebody in the future. Let's come back to the US. I hope that sparked your interest in what's to come from that international research. Let's come back to the US and think for a moment what people of faith think about science, okay? You're still with me? This is a lot to throw at you, so just hang in there. So here we did this general population survey of the US public, and we also, remember, surveyed what I would call rank and file scientists. So those who, some of whom work in universities, some of whom work in research and development. Let me just point out some things from our statistics. Don't get overwhelmed by this table. So of all respondents in our survey, about 23% identify as evangelical Protestant. That's not too different from what other surveys find in the general population. And about 17% of these rank and file scientists identify as evangelical Protestant. You might remember back that's pretty different from what I found among the most elite scientists, or those at the most elite research universities is better put. Here, if you look at just the entire set of religious traditions of scientists in the sample, about 19% Catholic, 4% Jewish, about 2% Mormon, and then perhaps inappropriately, given the diversity of traditions, because of small numbers, I have to lump together those from Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, and Jains, which really have nothing in common except that they're not Christians. And so that's know that that's just a matter of convenience there because of small number sizes. So what's good to point out from this is that if you know anything about ratios, I put here all the way to the end of this table the extent to which these are over or underrepresented in the scientific community. So what are these religious traditions are over or underrepresented? So we see that evangelicals are a bit underrepresented in the general science community, really underrepresented among scientist elite research universities. They're overrepresented for those who are Jewish, overrepresented for what we call the non-Western religious traditions, also overrepresented in atheists, agnostics, and no religion, but still more evangelicals in the general population of scientists when compared to scientist elite research universities. Let's look for a moment at how the general population views this whole matter of conflict between religion and science. Is this a tenable idea? So about 1/5 of the general population perceive tension between religious communities and scientists. 20% perceive hostility by, that's a strong word, 20% perceive hostility by religious people towards science, 22% perceive hostility by scientists towards religion. So there's appreciable minority, right, of the American public thinks there is a problem, right, thinks that, you know, like that woman in that church, that perhaps scientists are out to eat Christian children for lunch. So there is a perceived problem. Whether or not that's the case, I think it's good to report it and name it for what it is, that it's there. Here's a woman that we interviewed who works as a financial administrator, thinks of herself as an evangelical. She says, "It seems to me like a scientist who doesn't have faith, who doesn't have any beliefs, it seems like there could be some possibility of disrespect. It seems like the one that has no faith or religion can actually kind of dismiss or wants to dismiss a person who does have faith." So that, and this came up over and over again, the perception, especially among the evangelicals that we interviewed, that scientists really are disrespectful towards them. When we turn to asking them about their views on the religion and science relationship, we find a kind of intriguing perspective. So of those in the general population who identify as evangelical Protestant, About 30% see themselves as, religion and science as conflict, and they consider themselves to be on the side of religion. But you'll notice here also that about 48%, I inappropriately didn't highlight that, about 48% of the evangelical Protestants see religion and science as having the potential to be in collaboration, thinking that each can be used to help support the other. So that there's the perception, if there's the perception that there's total conflict in this particular faith community, that is inaccurate. Not quite 50% see the potential for religion and science to actually be in collaboration. And that's important to pull out and recognize if we care about there being dialogue between these communities. When we turn to looking at these rank and file scientists compared to evangelicals, we do find they're somewhat different in their religious identities and practices. About 44% of evangelicals think of themselves as very religious compared to only 15% of the rank and file scientists. About 42% of evangelicals say they attend religious services weekly. About 55% say they pray several times a day compared to only 19% of the rank and file scientists. 41% rather, read religious texts weekly compared to only 14% of the rank and file scientists. 87% of evangelicals say they have no doubts about the existence of God, which I find absolutely fascinating. And 36% of scientists, of these rank and file scientists, say they have no doubts about the existence of God. Again, among the rank and file scientists, much greater appreciation for particular religious beliefs and practices and identities than among these scientists in more elite research universities. Let's look at, again, another way of thinking about the religion and science conflict framing. 12% of evangelicals perceive hostility by religious people towards science, and 37% of evangelicals perceive hostility by scientists towards religion. And this quote from a man who's in the military, I think, puts some texture to this, who says that I think that especially in that field, meaning science, people would be more apt to find a bone in the ground and say, this is the missing link. This is what proves evolution. We can finally shut up those rotten Christians. So he perceives, I've not actually heard a scientist say that, but he perceives that there is this kind of inherent hostility in the science community, particularly around the issue of evolution. When we turn to these rank and file scientists, about 22% of them perceive hostility by religious people towards science. 24% of scientists perceive hostility by scientists towards religion, and about 12% of evangelical scientists perceive hostility by religious people towards science. And 57% of evangelical scientists perceive hostility by scientists towards religion. And that's something to dwell on for just a second, that there is this perception among scientists that are evangelical, that other scientists are somewhat hostile towards religion. So where do religious people, and particularly evangelicals, turn to find their information about science? And that's something, remember, we wanted to know how science enters congregational life, and I think this is worth repeating a little bit. So with a question about science, evangelicals are just as likely as the general population to consult a person in a scientific occupation. This shouldn't make scientists feel that good, right? Only 14% of evangelicals and only 14% of people in the general population actually think they can consult a real living and breathing scientist. So something's going on there that people don't know very many scientists. Scientists are not perceived as accessible. So, get out there, scientists, and do your thing and make yourselves accessible, I think is a good take-home message. I'm sure these scientists in this room are a real exception to that. But also, evangelicals are more than twice as likely as the general population to consult people in their congregation. Again, small numbers, but an appreciable magnitude difference, about 7% versus 3%. They are really more likely, 10% versus 4%, to consult a religious leader. So 10% of evangelicals consult a religious leader about a scientific matter, and 11% consult a religious text about a scientific matter. So this is an appreciable minority who are consulting religious leaders and texts about scientific matters. So religion and science kind of getting together in that way for these folks. It's important to know what's at stake, really, in the religion and science connection for the people that we interviewed who are evangelicals. Here's one from an evangelical who says, as a Christian, creation, really, it's all or nothing. Either the entire Bible's right or it's all wrong. Either everything inside of it is 100% accurate or none of it is. So if creation could be disproven, take that away. That just devastates my entire way of life, my entire being. So you have to remember that for some people, not everyone, but for some people in congregations, it is extremely important to have a science that feels compatible with Scripture. And this evolution issue can be a real stickler for people in thinking through how the theory of evolution is compatible with Scripture. So we ask them about evolution, and we ask them a kind of complicated question about evolution, which I think is better and more complicated than some other simple measures that have been used in the past. So God created the universe, the earth, and all of life within the past 10,000 years, or creationist perspective. About 22% in the general population hold that perspective compared to 43% of evangelicals. God created the universe and the earth billions of years ago. God started in his guided human evolution, sort of God-guided evolution. There you see 23% of evangelicals and about 18% of the general population. The intelligent design perspective, the universe and earth came into being billions of years ago and human evolved over millions of years according to the design of intelligent force. That does not seem to be particularly popular. So that seems to be popular among only kind of a group of elites who are pushing that perspective. But in the general population, either they want a strict creationist perspective or God-initiated evolution perspective. And then natural evolution, a pretty low proportion of the general population, about 10%, believe in a strict natural evolution that doesn't involve a God at all. So just to come back here, I think it's important to remember that there is perceived room for collaboration in this community among evangelicals, 48%. And I'll end this section with this quote, that science and religion go hand in hand. And if you're a scientist and you're working in your field, I think you get to experience God's presence when you come to work. Evangelicals generally as interested in science as the general public. And they are also, those who are evangelical scientists seem to really have a foot in both worlds. About 73% of evangelical Protestant scientists really see these two as being really completely in collaboration. And when we look at evangelical scientists, these who I think of having as a foot in both worlds, we see that they are very religious, tend to attend religious services weekly, 54%, very committed to prayer, to read religious texts weekly, have no doubts about God. So those who are in the kind of rank and file scientific community, those who are outside the elite research university environment, may be the ones who act as our bridge builders between the scientific and the religious communities, that's a possibility if we are concerned about dialogue. Here's a quote from an evangelical scientist that says, I think the church needs basically to drop its fear of science. Both the church and science are interested in the truth. Now, there are a little bit different aspects of the truth, but I don't think that either side needs to view the other antagonistically. And I understand how science feels because some of the past oppressions from the church, so maybe there needs to be forgiveness on both sides. So why should people of faith care about all of these numbers and all of this stuff that you've just sat through? I think we dispel some stereotypes here that have had a real hold in particular faith communities. And if we dispel those stereotypes, I think there's more possibility for going forward in productive ways. First, U.S. scientists may be more religious than we might think. It's certainly not the case that all of them are virulently against religious people. They're different than the general public, but they do often have a real sense of spiritual openness. So conflict does not seem to describe them as well as a kind of complex religious environment, a complex approach to religion. When we move internationally, we see that in a place like the UK, which is seen as being kind of at the avant-garde of secularism, still, scientists see themselves as almost as carriers of secularization, but there's still kind of a spiritual openness there as well, a way in which they utilize religion when making moral decisions about science. In India, it seems that they are not really perceived to be carriers of secularization. This really raises questions about scientists in different national communities and the relationship they have to religion. There are religious people in science in both the UK and India, and the religious minorities in both of those places that have an impact on science really may be different around the globe. It may be that the religion and science conflict is kind of a Western conflict, and we want to try that on, that if we go into different national contexts, that there may be a completely different relationship between religion and science. This research hits home to me in particular ways. I think we've often misjudged atheists. We've misjudged atheist scientists in particular. They are not always hostile to faith communities. Also, science is not always the cause of unbelief from their own mouths, right? You cannot trap a scientist or someone who's going to be a scientist from birth and follow them over their entire lives. That would be a huge breach of research ethics and also very time-consuming. But I think it's important to remember that there are many scientists who are persons of faith, who are sitting alongside others in the pews. Religious leaders, we find when we study the general public, are very important in communicating attitudes towards science. And so if there are scientists who are persons of faith in the room who want to get together with their own religious leaders and help them learn more robust and effective ways to communicate the value of science, that would be time well spent. It seems that people sitting in the pews are receptive to that kind of instruction, and that's very important. If Christians are underrepresented in science, and so something that we need to think about as a community, perhaps, if we care about there being open access to all different kinds of professions, to Christians, say, who are in youth groups, and for those of you who see science as a possible calling, as understanding God's natural world as a possible calling, we need to make that seem more open to people in the very earliest experience in their church communities. I want to put up again this quote from a woman who in my book I call Evelyn, who was raised in an evangelical community and said, when I was asked hard questions, I was told just to make a decision to believe. My experience with religion was that it was a way that judgment was passed on people who are different. And think about how perhaps her life, her faith life, would have been different if she was told that she could ask the hard questions and really explore her own inquisitive nature, and that the faith had room for that. I think that's a very important thing, and perhaps we should end on that message. Let me show you a little bit just about the program that I direct at Rice, the Religion and Public Life program, where we bring together students and scholars of various types to explore religion in the public sphere and the various ways it shows up. And if you want to continue to follow me along as I'm on this journey of studying scientists in different national contexts and studying the general faith lives and how science comes up in faith life, really welcome you to keep visiting our website, and we'll keep funneling information there about our studies. This has been a very rich experience, and I am very happy to have visited here. So thank you so much for your attention.